Welcome to Simply Sewing with Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and border print fabrics make great skirts and great wrap skirts. The only difference is we're going to have to change the layout of the pattern so it fits on the border print. A border print fabric is a fabric where there's a design along one edge, and as you come up and around to the other edge of the fabric, some border prints will have a border on both sides coming into the inside. And in this case, we have the one border print on the one side coming all the way up to the top. So when we open it up, we have the large picture on one side and it's still directional up to the top. And this would look great along the bottom of a skirt. The pattern does run along the selvage, and it is from the company called Canvas, and the fabric line is Poppy Promenade. Most patterns have us cutting the fabric with those selvage edges together and the fold along the top. As we can see in these layouts, we have the fold and the selvages together. If we were to follow this layout, our border would be running along this edge. And this is the bottom of the skirt, and this is the bottom of the skirt. So we won't end up using that pattern at all. So we do need to change the layout. Instead of having those selvages meet, we're going to have the selvage run along itself. So we're going to match up that selvage. We have the selvage on one end and the selvage on the other. We still have a fold and the raw edges are meeting. And before I cut any pattern, I make sure that I iron my fabric. I don't want any folds or wrinkles in it. If any adjustments need to be made on your pattern pieces, be sure to do them before you cut out your fabric. A wrap skirt usually consists of two pieces. We have a back piece, and that needs to sit on a fold. Then we have a front piece. They will be a lot larger because these are going to wrap one on top of another in order to give us that wrap skirt. Here's the bottom of my skirt, so I do want it to sit on the bottom right along that edge. I want as much as my pattern showing, so I'm going to find an area which I will consider my hemline. My hemline is going to sit right along that edge, and I start with my back piece where I have this fold. So I have the fold and both my selvages together and my two raw edges. Place that one piece along the fold and match up where you want the bottom to be. This is the first piece that I pin on. When that first back piece has been pinned on, we're going to be able to place our fronts on. We need to cut one of the back because it's on the fold, but we do need two of the front. We have one line right down the center, and that is for the fabric to be on the straight of grain. So that is still very important to have. So that needs to be straight. We can find the straight of grain on the fabric right with this fold. I have in my sewing room a carpenter's ruler. This is a metal thick ruler that you can get in the hardware store. It's 48 inches long, but I love the sturdiness of this so that I can find my measurements. I have my hemlines matched up. From the fold over to the straight of grain, mine happens to be 20 inches. So it's maintained that 20 inches all the way along this straight of grain. This now is going to make sure that all of that pattern is along the bottom of my skirt. With both those fabrics together, I know that my pattern is going to flow all the way along the bottom of my skirt. When we're trying to figure out how much fabric to buy, we might need less, but we also might need more. If you can get your pattern first, that would be ideal because we do need enough to go along that bottom. So it will depend on your personal pattern as to how much fabric you're going to need. So this hem measurement times 2 is how much length of fabric we're going to need, plus a little bit, just so that we can make sure our lines are straight. I do have a little extra room along the top, and this is where I'm going to be able to cut my secondary pieces. I have a back-facing piece that needs to be put on the fold. The front-facing, I'm going to need 2. And I do want to find that straight of grain. I also have my ties. So by laying all of my pattern pieces out, I can see I'm going to have enough. The pattern I'm making today is a Burda 6733. So it is a wrap skirt and it has 2 different lengths. So let's go through these directions and make this skirt. The first thing we need to do is sew the darts. We will have 2 darts on the back of the skirt and a dart in the front of the skirt. When those darts have been stitched down, they need to be pressed towards the center. The 2 front pieces coming towards the center, the 2 back pieces also towards the center. We now get to match up those side pieces. So we're going to have these 2 large pieces in the front that will cross over. On the left-hand side, we're going to be able to stitch all the way down using a 5/8 seam allowance. On the right side, we're going to stitch a little bit at the top and then all the way down. The markings that we transferred is going to be this little opening. So we're going to stitch here 5/8, skip this spot and continue stitching down 5/8. So we're going to have a little hole in that area. Once the sides are stitched, we're going to be able to neaten up those edges. We could use a zigzag stitch on the sewing machine or use a serger and clean off those edges. But we do not want to serge those edges together and closed. We need to work on each side individual because we do need to keep this spot open. So neaten up the edges on both sides. When those seams have been neatened up, press the seams open and that will expose that one hole on that one side. The other side is still pressed open, but there's no hole at the top. Put the skirt aside so that we can work on the ties. We're going to have 1 short tie and 1 long tie, and both the short and the long one are going to be treated the same way. Put right sides together and stitch a 5/8 on one side, pivot, and come all the way down right off this end and do a little back stitch here. Once you have these edges stitched down, we need to trim off the extra. And I've darkened the stitching line so you can see. We need to just trim off a little bit on the corners and trim off a little bit at the bottom here. Now we can turn this right side out. Be sure to press it flat right along that seam edge. And you have a choice if you'd like to top stitch, or you can leave it the way it is. I personally like to do a little row of top stitch. I like the way it keeps those edges nice and crisp looking. The long tie and short ties are now done, and we're going to be able to put them on the skirt front. The front side, where we have this little hole, we need to add the short tie. So we can take that raw edge, match up our markings, base that tie on. The long tie is going on the skirt that fits underneath. Match up those marks so it's down a little bit and just baste this on. We now get to work on the facing of the skirt. We have the 1 piece, and this is going to be the back piece, and 2 pieces cut, and those will be going to the fronts. We can match up those notches, so these will be the 2 side seams. We have the back, and this will be the front. Just like the skirt, the left side is going to have a solid seam. The right side needs to have that opening just like we did in the skirt, and those openings are going to match. So I will stitch the 5/8 seam here, skip over, and stitch the 5/8 seam allowance there. When those seams are stitched, press those seams open so they match the skirt. This inside facing gets to be stitched on the top of the skirt. The hole in the skirt is going to match the hole in that facing. So those seams will match right up. The rest of that piece will fit right on. And all we have to do is move this out of the way. This top edge will match up. Be sure that the inner facing is facing up so that both right sides are touching. Stitch a 5/8 seam allowance all the way from one edge to another. Being careful not to catch those ties. Once this facing is on, clean up this edge at the bottom of that facing. A zigzag or a serge stitch will be fine. We need to do 1 stitch on each side. Match up those edges, Keep that tie out of the way and stitch 5/8 of an inch. And do this to both sides. Now we're going to be able to take this piece and turn this whole edge out. So we're going to see the skirt front, the ties, and that facing in the back. Bring this up and over. Give it a second pressing so that that seam is right along the top. Once this has been pressed down, we can do a row of top stitching right along that waistline. That's going to help keep that facing inside. And before we do any finishing touches, we now can do the hem. The sides will be done last. Depending on the hem that you wanted to do, you can do it now. I'm going to turn a little edge and then turn it up. So this total hem space would be 1 5/8 of an inch. Once the hem has been put up, we need to finish off this one edge. That's the edge where the tie comes out. We did a 5/8 seam allowance here, so we will need to roll this over 5/8 of an inch. So turn all of this over at 5/8 of an inch and press. We can roll in the raw edge inside. So all of the raw edges are inside, and we're going to have this nice finished edge. That 5/8 seam allowance is going to match right up at the top. So this inside seam will be just rolled over inside. When that front edge has been rolled over, we are almost done. I was able to stitch down that seam and stitch right along the top. So I have a little extra stitching just to secure this on. This pattern does come with some belt loops along the back. Some patterns have them and some do not. To make those belt loops, we're going to start with that one long strip, fold those edges inside and over. Do 2 rows of stitching. With that stitching done, we're going to be able to cut this piece into 4. The pattern did have markings for them. It's going to go near the one dart, in the center, the second dart, and on that second edge. It won't be needed on this edge because this hole will make up for the loop. Fold both of those edges over, stitch back and forth with those in place. I now have my belt loops or belt carriers on the back. One final step, and it's just a little hand stitch. And this is optional, but I really like the way it looks. We have the top opening and the back opening. I want to hand stitch those edges closed. It's just going to be easier to get that tie through without trying to get in between the layers. And just a little whip stitch to hold those pieces together. You could machine stitch around here, but I really like doing it by hand. That way I make sure it's nice and straight. And at the same time, I bring my thread down to the bottom and just catch a little bit of this seam to hold this down. The wrap skirt is now done. The left side has that long tail on it, and that is going to go through the hole. Then the right is going to come over the top. We're going to be able to take that tie and loop it in through these belt loops. That brings us to both ties on our left-hand side. And that is where we're going to be able to tie it and adjust it. A wrap skirt is a great skirt to showcase those border prints. The border print is inside, goes all the way around to the outside. The ties also could have been done in a coordinating red fabric. You could do a big bow or just leave it long and streaming. It could be made short and even longer. We just need to cut the hem where all that border print is going to be. Some skirts are a little bit more flared out, some are a little bit more trimmed. But when you look at the skirt, it looks like a fitted skirt. But we have the comfort of the wrap. Wrap skirts can be formal, can be used for the beach, or can just be made for fun. Thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're going to sew or talk about next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.